In late August 1988, a man's body was found in Sheridan, Colorado, a suburb just south of Denver. The location where the body had been left was in the 2800 block of West Oxford Avenue. At the time, law enforcement did not know the identity of the man. He had no identification on him, and despite efforts at the time, investigators were unable to determine who he was or what had caused his death. The body was entered into law enforcement records as an unidentified homicide victim, commonly referred to as a John Doe. The investigation in 1988 focused on the circumstances that led to the man's death. Deputies from the Sheridan Police Department and the Colorado Bureau of Investigation documented the scene and collected as much physical evidence as possible. The body showed signs that the death was a homicide rather than the result of natural causes. According to the investigation, there were no immediate leads pointing to a suspect or motive, and the victim remained unidentified. At the time, investigators made some assumptions about the man's possible origins based on his appearance and the items found with him, but no identification could be confirmed. For decades, the victim's identity was unknown. The cold case, classified as an unresolved homicide from 1988, was maintained in regional and national databases for unidentified decedents. Over the years, the case remained cold. Law enforcement periodically reviewed the evidence in hopes of new developments, but for many years there were no breakthroughs. The victim's case file stayed open with the Sheridan Police Department and the Colorado Bureau of Investigation, and authorities continued to preserve the physical evidence collected at the scene. Advances in forensic science in the decades after 1988 eventually created new possibilities for solving cases that had previously yielded no results. DNA analysis technology and later investigative genetic genealogy became tools law enforcement could use to revisit cold cases. Investigative genetic genealogy involves comparing DNA extracted from evidence to genetic information from public genealogy databases in order to identify relatives of an unknown individual and work backward to establish identity. These techniques became increasingly common in the late 2010s for identifying unidentified decedents and unknown suspects in cold homicide cases. In 2020, the Sheridan Police Department asked the Colorado Bureau of Investigation, CBI, to review the decades-old case using modern forensic methods. Investigators and forensic analysts re-examined the stored evidence, which had been preserved since the original 1988 investigation. Because genetic material had been preserved on some items, forensic scientists were able to extract enough DNA to create a comprehensive genetic profile of the unidentified victim. This profile could then be used in modern investigative databases. The genetic profile indicated that the unidentified man was of Middle Eastern descent, contradicting earlier assumptions that he may have been from a different region. With that information, analysts used genetic genealogy techniques, comparing the DNA profile to publicly submitted profiles in genealogy databases to identify potential distant relatives. By building family trees and narrowing down possible family connections, investigators worked to trace the victim's identity through his relatives. The genetic genealogy work led investigators to trace a family connection in Israel. Investigators were eventually able to identify the man as Akram Bada'an, a 36-year-old, a man believed to have ties to that region. The positive identification came after decades of the victim being recorded only as an unidentified decedent. Sheridan Police and CBI officials publicly announced the identification in October 2021, more than 33 years after his body was discovered. Law enforcement agencies made the identification public at a press conference. Sheridan Police Detective Brian Penry noted that one of the most important aspects of the resolution was giving the victim his name back, emphasizing the significance of identifying victims in cold cases even when a case remains unresolved in terms of finding the perpetrator. The identification allowed Akram Bada'an's family to know what had happened to him after all those years. While the victim's identity was finally established, the investigation into the circumstances of his death remained active. Authorities told the public that solving the question of who Akram Bada'an was only one part of the larger case. They continued to ask for information about events leading up to his death or any tips that might help determine how and why he was killed. At the time of the announcement, police also shared that a reward was available for information that could lead to answers about the homicide, and they encouraged anyone with relevant information to contact Metro Denver Crime Stoppers. The identification of Akram Bada'an highlighted both the value and limitations of modern forensic investigation. While DNA analysis and genetic genealogy provided answers about his identity, the circumstances of his death, who was responsible and why, had not yet been determined publicly by law enforcement. Authorities continued to classify the case as an active homicide investigation with the goal of seeking justice for Bada'an and understanding the events that led to his death in 1988. Sheridan Police and the Colorado Bureau of Investigation emphasized that the case's resolution regarding identity did not close the homicide investigation, but it did represent a significant step in providing closure to the victim's family. By applying modern technology to decades-old evidence, investigators could finally give his family a name and a connection to their relative that had been missing for more than 3 decades. Authorities explained that identifying the victim was crucial for moving the investigation forward. Knowing who Akram Bada'an was allowed investigators to explore his background, history, and known associates in hopes of uncovering why he had been in Colorado in 1988 and how he came to be killed. In seeking information, police asked the public to come forward with any details that might explain Bada'an's movements or the events that preceded his death. Officials involved in the case noted that forensic evidence preserved at the time of the initial investigation was critical to the later identification. The ability to extract DNA from items stored for more than 30 years demonstrated the importance of evidence preservation in cold cases. Without that preserved evidence, the identification of Akram Bada'an might not have been possible. Akram Bada'an was 36 years old when his body was found in Sheridan in late August 1988. For decades, he was recorded as an unidentified decedent, and only through modern forensic analysis, including genetic genealogy, was his identity finally established decades later. While the homicide itself remained unsolved in terms of determining responsibility, naming the victim allowed law enforcement and family members to acknowledge his life and work towards greater clarity about the events that led to his death. In the spring of 1971, 15-year-old Winston Arthur Maxey III left his home in Boise, Idaho, and traveled west toward Oregon. Winston had learned from a friend that there were employment opportunities on the Oregon coast, and he told his sister he planned to go to Coos Bay in search of work. He left in the spring, intending to hitchhike to the coast, and his family never heard from him again after he departed. At the time, Winston's parents chose not to file a missing persons report, and his disappearance went unrecorded in official missing person databases for decades. In July 1971, several months after Winston left Boise, 3 local teenagers were moving horses between pastures near Snedden Creek in Coos Bay, Oregon, when they discovered a body. The remains belonged to a juvenile male. The condition of the body made visual identification difficult, and the authorities at the time were unable to determine his identity. The Coos County Sheriff's Office and the Oregon State Medical Examiner investigated the case, but without identification, the cause of death could not be determined. The body was recorded as an unidentified male juvenile and was buried in a local cemetery with a marker indicating his unidentified status. In the early 1970s, law enforcement lacked the technological tools available to investigators in later decades. The body was examined for identifying features and potential leads, and officers canvassed the surrounding area of Snedden Creek and Coos Bay for witnesses or information about a missing youth, but no credible leads emerged. Without fingerprints or DNA technology capable of comparison to national databases, the unidentified remains were ultimately recorded as a cold case and remained without resolution. Over the next several decades, the case of the unidentified juvenile remained open but inactive. The remains, buried in the Coos Bay area, continued to be listed in law enforcement records as an unidentified decedent. Periodically, detectives reviewed the file and discussed the possibility of future advances in forensic science that might one day shed light on the unknown youth's identity, but there were no major developments for many years. Meanwhile, Winston's family in Idaho never received information that could explain his fate. Winston's parents and siblings moved on with their lives, unaware that his body lay unidentified hundreds of miles away in Oregon. In the months before leaving, Winston had fathered a child, a daughter he did not know existed. That daughter was born in 1971 and was placed for adoption soon after her birth. The daughter grew up without knowing her biological father's identity or what had happened to him. In 2016, Winston's daughter began searching for her biological parents after turning 18 and learning that she had been adopted. She hired a private investigator to locate her birth mother, which resulted in finding her mother and learning the name of her biological father, Winston Arthur Maxey III. After this initial breakthrough, she created a Facebook page titled "Where in the World is Winston Maxey?" and began publicizing his story in hopes of finding information about his whereabouts. She also attempted to file a missing persons report, but because Winston had never been officially reported missing and there were no formal records, her efforts initially encountered challenges with law enforcement systems. In 2017, more than 45 years after the remains were discovered in Coos Bay, the Coos County Sheriff's Office and the Oregon State Medical Examiner agreed to exhume the unidentified remains in order to obtain DNA samples that could be used for modern forensic analysis. Investigators and forensic scientists hoped that the preserved bone could yield enough genetic material to generate a profile suitable to comparison to contemporary databases. The remains were carefully removed and prepared for DNA testing. By May 2021, advances in genetic technology made it possible for forensic laboratories to generate a detailed DNA profile from the exhumed remains. Samples were sent to Parabon Nanolabs, a private forensic DNA analysis company that specializes in investigative genetic genealogy. Parabon scientists were able to extract a DNA profile that included information about the individual's ancestry, eye color, skin tone, hair color, and facial morphology. They also developed a composite profile showing what the unidentified juvenile might have looked like in life based on genetic markers. Investigative genetic genealogists, including experts such as C.C. Moore, used the DNA profile to search public genealogy databases where individuals voluntarily submit their genetic information for ancestry research. By identifying distant relatives and constructing family trees, investigators narrowed down potential matches that could lead to the identity of the unidentified youth found in Coos Bay. Through this method, they traced the genetic links to relatives in the Idaho area, including family members of Winston Maxey. After building these family connections, law enforcement reached out to Winston's known relatives to obtain reference DNA samples. A DNA sample from Winston's sister confirmed a familial match to the DNA profile developed from the remains. Investigators also compared the DNA profile to that of Winston's daughter, who had submitted her own DNA during her search for her father. Those comparisons confirmed that the unidentified juvenile was in fact Winston Arthur Maxey III, who had disappeared in 1971 at age 15. The positive identification was announced publicly in July and October 2021, more than 50 years after his disappearance. The identification finally gave Winston his name back after decades known only as Frog Boy, a reference derived from the Snedden Creek area where his remains were found. The sheriff's office described the identification as a significant milestone, closing the missing aspects of the case regarding his identity and allowing his family to know what had happened to him. Law enforcement began working with Winston's family on producing a death certificate and arrangements to return his remains to Idaho for burial with his family, ending his long period as an unidentified decedent. Despite the positive identification, many details surrounding Winston's death remain unknown. Investigators and Winston's daughter have expressed uncertainty about the exact circumstances of his death and whether it was accidental or the result of foul play. The condition of the remains and lack of forensic evidence from the original 1971 investigation meant that determining a specific cause of death has been difficult. No official conclusion has been publicly released about how Winston died, and the investigation into the circumstances of his death remains officially open with the Coos County Sheriff's Office. Winston's daughter continues efforts to gather information that could explain what happened to her father after he left Boise. She has maintained the Facebook page dedicated to his case and, in the process, established organizations to support families searching for answers about missing loved ones. Her efforts and the involvement of genetic genealogy specialists highlighted how sustained family advocacy and modern forensic science can solve long-standing unknowns about a person's identity even when that person was never previously reported missing. The identification of Winston Arthur Maxey III represents one of the increasingly documented instances where investigative genetic genealogy has provided answers in cold cases that were otherwise unsolvable with traditional forensic techniques. While his cause of death remains undetermined, the restoration of his name to the unidentified remains in Coos Bay marked an important achievement for both law enforcement and his family, offering a factual resolution to the question of who he was. Winston Arthur Maxey III was born on October 4, 1954 in Rupert, Idaho, and was 15 years old when he left home in 1971, intending to reach Coos Bay, Oregon. His remains were discovered that summer near Snedden Creek, but remained unidentified for more than 5 decades until modern DNA analysis finally provided answers.